an ERC starting grant project. We began in 2021 in February. And now we are pretty much on the 18th, 19th month of the project, so 1.5 years. We've been conducting some data collection already in some parts of the project. As you can imagine, it's a big project. It's now a 7-country study looking at, producing and consuming countries. So we focus on Brazil, China, and Kazakhstan. We focus mainly on rare earth, but generally, I think we've been expanding and looking at the critical mineral sector space more generally. So for example, we've expanded to niobium in the context of Brazil because that's the most strategic mineral that they have at the moment. Then we're looking into possibly uranium and other critical minerals in Kazakhstan. We also started incorporating some work on base metals like nickel in the Philippines. And the rationale behind that is because I think the debate, the race for critical minerals is not a race of specific minerals, but a general tendency over how to resolve the question of secured access, stable secured access to minerals, as policymakers would say. But also, I think it's a general question that I'm particularly interested, which is it's a question of economic development. It's a question of how countries can use their minerals towards industrial development. Basically, the idea of developing countries trying to catch up with the more advanced industrialized countries. So that's the point of view of the project. Having said that, I think one of the most obvious debate that we ended up sort of being very much intertwined, is the question of how consuming countries, are going to address the costs of having to import their raw materials. And that question of cost is it's a very broad concept, I think. On the one hand, it's about the cost when you don't have the minerals itself. So for example, in the case of Korea and Japan, they don't have natural resources. And so they need to extract these minerals from somewhere else. They need to have a global strategy around it. But it's also about cost in terms of a refusal to extract the mineral. And that's the particular case of the European Union, which is the talk of the day. So just to give you a broad idea in terms of where the project is located, there are different arms and it moves in different directions. But the focus here is the idea of cost in respect to the refusal to extract these minerals. So I decided to structure this around the white paper that was produced by the LDE. So that also means it's easier to follow. But then I updated some of the concepts that we've been using here and some of the ideas that have been evolving since the production of that paper. So first, I'm going to talk about what do we mean by strategic autonomy in the space of the critical minerals sector. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about what in political science, in anthropology, in the social science, as we call the politics of sacrifice, the creation of sacrifice zones. And then I'm going to zoom out and really look into how the EU has responded to all these moving parts in the supply chain. And then finally, I'm going to give you an epilogue and really look into what might the future look like in the next couple of years, given what we know in the past and currently. Okay, what do we mean by strategic autonomy in the critical minerals race? And what does it mean for the European Union? What does it mean to have a strategic approach towards getting secured access to critical minerals? In the project that we basically in the past couple of months, when we've been doing interviews at the EU level, just in terms of data collection, we basically use qualitative research methods. So we usually interview high-level politicians, political elites, business associations. So most of the interviews we've conducted so far, we've interviewed mining companies in Europe, Leading Edge, for example, in Sweden. We've interviewed them. We've interviewed Canadian companies involved. We interviewed the Business Association, the European Mines Association in Brussels, but also we've been engaging with at the policy level. I'm highly involved in the debates with, for example, the Wilson Center in the U.S. In Brussels, we talk quite frequently with the European Commission that's in charge of raw materials extraction. So that's just to give you in terms of methodological, approach. This is where we come in. We basically look at we basically talk to very selected people, mostly elites, and then look into how these different points of views that they have converge or diverge. Um, at a very broad level, I think strategic autonomy is very coherent as a concept. At the EU level, for example, they have a very clear idea of what they want to be. They want to know, they want to be autonomous from China, they want to be autonomous from Russia. So there's a clearer concept at the macro political level, at the policy level. But actually, the moment we went down and looked into the national level debates, and we started looking at, Sweden, and then now we're looking at Germany, the debates in Germany, what you often find is that this big coherent idea is actually very ambiguous. And the critical minerals question will really highlight this discrepancy between the EU, what the EU aspires to be, and then how it operates, and how it is concretely implemented on the ground. Um, I think I'm going to start. I'm going to skip very quickly because this is really more for the political scientists. But I think it's just important to know what we mean by strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy, essentially, as at least as perceived by the European Union, is about being able to maneuver the shifting dynamics of power politics, and also to be able to manage as the gravity of economic power moves towards the east. And I think this is particularly interesting because for a very long time, I've always thought, I mean, personally, I've always thought the EU policymakers are not aware of the fact that, China has risen, Japan and Korea, the economic gravity that manufacturing, high-tech sectors, these have all started to move from the west to the east. But so one surprising thing is that they're actually really aware that there is a shift in power politics. It's just that they don't know how to respond. I think that was the main reflection that I have here. And so the concept of strategic autonomy is really the ability to maneuver this change, is to be able to manage the transition. That might be in the form of a defense of the current order, the international liberal order that we have. The fact that, the EU repeatedly defends openness, multilateral cooperation, globalization as, a public good. That this is so what, the status quo is fine, basically. It's also about selective engagement with specific powers across different policy areas. So that means decoupling realms of conflicts and cooperation, moving away from places where they can't win, and then moving into places of cooperation, such as in climate change debates. There's a lot more engagement between China and the EU when it comes to climate politics, but not necessarily, for example, on the human rights question in Xinjiang. So selective engagement means you're able to take advantage of where you have strength in order to engage better and more effective in promoting your own interest. Um, and I see strategic autonomy as generally as an adjustment strategy to a changing global order, because we all know that there are so many shifts taking place. We don't know how these shifts will impact the long term. We know for sure that in the medium term, in the short term, there are specific changes that we need to respond to, notably, for example, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the rivalry between US and China. So strategic autonomy is a concept that the EU often uses to justify, to promote an adjustment strategy that would allow the EU to survive geopolitical competition. That leads to several questions. Number one, is there a core interest, so to speak, for the European Union? Is there a general direction in which we can say there are specific things that the EU needs to defend, and therefore that's the core of its strategic autonomy? That would be the basis of its strategic autonomy. The second question is, how does the EU view the world? What is the vision? Does it envision a world where globalization remains to be unfettered? It's based on market mechanisms, or is it going to be based in something else, such as politics or more security-oriented conception of the world order? Um, In the context of all of this, we know then that the EU launched what they call the New Green Deal. And the idea of the Green Deal, according to the people we spoke with at least, is that it is some way a political project. It is a way in which the EU can mobilize resources to be able to create a more coherent narrative and discourse. Um, so one clear implication of the greening of the new green deal is the transformation of various sectors moving from carbon intensive industries towards more substantive transformation in relation to new emerging clean energy green technology sectors. So this is how we can think and imagine, different initiatives such as decarbonizing the electric sector, greening the steel industry, the rise and the consolidation of hybrid and electric vehicle transport systems. So the political project is that eventually Europe will move towards a low carbon economy in which it will produce different kinds of industrially competitive sectors, such as downstream markets. And greening Europe means protecting and maintaining where EU has comparative advantage. So that means, for example, EU is a leading actor, generally leading firms. The European Union have leading firms, companies in the energy sector, in the digital sector, in advanced manufacturing. So the idea is that the EU needs to have a public policy that can enable and play a leading role such that there's a more coherent strategy as we emphasize and move towards these strategically important sectors for the European Union. And so the new vision for the European Union is that decarbonization is going to be the name of the game. It will play a very strong role in the global politics of decarbonizing carbon intensive economies. The other vision is to create new green jobs, moving away from traditional manufacturing towards more clean energy intensive. So for example, in the transport sector, in the car manufacturing sector, these will all be greener. And then, of course, as we all know, finally, the importance of investing in recycling and the circular economy. So at the macro level, at the very least, there is a vision, I think. There's an idea of how the green project can push the European Union to be more industrially competitive, to maintain its competitiveness, but also to advance certain sectors that would allow the EU to play a much bigger role, or at least maintain a role in this changing geopolitical climate. Now, at the core of the political project of greening Europe is the need for a secure, stable supply chain, which, from the language of the European Union, is about making sure that they're accessible in the world market. So this is, I think, where the big premise or the assumption of the Green Project is. And that's because it is based on the logic of it's basically based on the logic of international trade and globalization, that for the past 40 years, at least since the 1970s all the way to 2010, early 2010, we know that supply chains are very tight. We know that supply chains, are based on production of goods based on supply and demand, and therefore they are accessible if you're willing to pay the price at the world market. So the idea is that politics, and in particular states, should not be dictating how the supply chain would evolve. Now, one of the most important things to remember when we think about the green transition is that there is a substantial shift, or there's an expected substantial shift in terms of what would be generating revenue. So in the past, for a very long time, of course, coal is the main source of energy for a lot of countries. And so one of the biggest IEA report that was released in 2020 was predicting or is predicting that there will be a steady increase in revenues coming from the transition metals and a steady decline in the coal industry. So this is one of the predictions, or at least one of the estimations that they have in terms of why clean energy is going to be the new emerging industry in the 21st century. The second point is that the clean energy revolution is about creating a new market in which different metals will play a bigger role because of the worldwide shift towards renewable energy. So this is just an illustration in terms of how different technologies as part of the energy transition will create a substantial increase in the demand for the minerals. The key question, of course, and what most reports don't answer, is how the global market, how the world market will supply them, given the current changes that have been taking place, given the changes in the past 10, 15 years. Now, this is, I'm pretty sure some of you have looked at this. This is one of the first a major report on the critical raw materials assessment. It simply illustrates how much dependent the EU is in terms of getting these minerals. The most obvious, and the reason why we often talk about the China threat, or the vulnerability from China, is because a lot of these important minerals are still currently produced and processed in China. So it's not just that China holds the reserves and that they're going to extract them. China also has processing technology, and they've been moving up in the value chain and participating more and more in high tech, in the higher value added activities in the supply chain. The second source is, of course, South Africa. And generally, I think the African continent is being perceived to be the most important source of minerals for the European Union. And then Latin America, but Latin America is something that's a difficult space to work in, particularly because the US is equally interested in getting access to these natural resources in the region. What of course we don't discuss is that China is also equally trying to gain access to these different resources. So not only does China have the resources, China's economic policy on resource is resource conservation, and at the same time, it's trying to extract and gain and acquire strategic assets in Congo, as you know, in Chile, in Brazil. Some of the mines there are now owned by the Chinese, or have substantial participation share in the companies that operate on the ground. Now, what does this all mean for the European Union, and what does this mean in terms of our understanding of the distribution of environmental goods and bads? I like the concept that has often been used by anthropologists. The concept of sacrificial zones, areas of sacrifice zones, came from anthropologists and sociologists. And I think that concept is captured by the quote that I got from one of the interviews in the European Commission. This was back in 2021. We didn't have the war yet during this period. She says that, in that interview, mining seems to be something that's important, it's necessary, yet no one wants to do it. Everyone is happy to get the resources from the ground elsewhere, but they still regard natural resources in a very abstract way. And in a sense, I think that's really what really captures the complexity of the paradox that the EU faces. And this is where I think I describe the EU's dilemma as a double bind. So on the one hand, there's a general recognition that the EU needs to be a leader in and be responsible over historic carbon emissions, because if we look at historical industrialization, if we look at who actually polluted the world, clean in a lot of social science work, they often talk about the ecological debt of the colonial powers vis-a-vis the developing countries. And so one of the main answers coming from the European Union policy circuit is that we want to lead the green project. We want to promote clean technology as the answer to these to answer and to reduce carbon emissions in the 21st century. And yet, of course, as you all know, the paradox is that the green transition will require and is already demanding the intensive and extensive extraction of minerals. And so if the EU does not have mining projects within its borders, then the green transition, which is the answer to the historic carbon emissions, is going to be actually carried over by the countries that will be producing them in order to respond to the energy transition that we have to undertake in the EU and in North America. And this is just to highlight, this in very clear terms, in terms of data. There's a lot of calculations, as you know, in looking at the proportion and share of where the raw materials will come from, who gets to participate in the processed, in the the midstream sector, in the processed material sector, in the component sector, and then in the assembly. One of the most important, I think, data is, it's only a part. The reason why we always think China is a threat is because China has closed that loop between production and consumption. So China's presence can be observed from the raw material sector all the way to the process, all the way to the assembly. Um, and of course, we can anticipate with its new strategy that it will keep going up in the value chain and it will close that loop, and they will be starting to be also involved in the production of new energy vehicles, in the wind turbines. They're already there. But that's going to get stronger over the next couple of years because they have the resources, but they also have the processing technology and the right industrial policy to align the downstream sector, the development of the downstream sector, as well as the upstream and the midstream sector. And I think this is where the EU's vulnerability argument becomes very clear, because EU's strength is in the processed materials and components and assembly. Um, and without access to the minerals, as in the past, then it becomes vulnerable from the trying to acquire the minerals from somewhere else. And that's why the big question is, um, does the strategic autonomy approach, is the strategic autonomy approach realistic, given that the EU refuses to start new mining projects, to start securing and creating a stable supply within its own borders? And I think the flip side of that argument, because that's the geopolitical argument, the flip side is what happens to these sacrifice zones? What happens to these communities and these places that are going to face the brunt of extraction? So, as I said, anthropologists, political ecologists have often talked about areas of sacrifice in which these are considered to be byproducts of global capitalism. They are seen as the effects of the unfettered extractive logic, in which it leads to all these problems that we see in these mining communities. So the depopulation, the social dislocation, the impoverishment in some places, especially in places where there are no regulation over the distribution of the benefits of mining, in addition to the health hazards that come together with the processing and refining and the extraction of critical minerals. Um, the political scientists have often looked at market environmentalism as the reason why we have this asymmetric exposure. So, of course, if you're closer to the mines, you're directly exposed to the processes of refining and production, and therefore you faced most of the cost. But that process is justified in the name of national interest, in the name of economic development. So the idea of sacrifice zone isn't just about EU, North America wanting to get access to the minerals. It also operates at the national level, between the national government and their local communities, between the national government and the local government. In the context of mining, the discourse of economic progress and the collective race against climate change has been used as a justification for the rapid expansion of carbon-intensive operations. So the promise of better health standards, education, reducing the poverty, and of course, sometimes even the rights for nature have been used in order to, promote mineral extraction in these places. So the question then that comes out is, are we then looking at new forms of colonialism here? Namely, the extraction takes place in specific geographies, specifically in resource-rich developing countries, but not in the borders of of the industrialized countries that actually want the renewable energy transition to be done as quickly as possible. The other aspect here is that China became the dominant producer by absorbing the environmental costs. And so for 2, 3 decades, there has not been a lot of discussion over the problems, the environmental damages of rare earth extraction, for example. And supply chain issues only became relevant, and the idea of being more autonomous in supply chain, and to make sure that there's no disruption in the supply chain, this only became clearly articulated during the COVID-19 pandemic, when we realized everything was being produced in China. And so when China can't send them abroad, most supply chains have broken down. So that's one aspect of that. The other aspect is that there is a general tendency of what we call the not in my backyard attitude, that's particularly pervasive in communities in the EU and in North America. They often are protests around the right to landscape, meaning they don't want to ruin the landscape, they want to protect the environment, etc. Now, there's always a debate whether that's, do they have that right or not. Of course, we all think that we should have a right to a good environment, but I think what's important to focus on are the effects. So NIMBYism basically in the global north has created two effects. One is it shifts the pressure on poorer resource-rich countries, and it incentivizes them to intensify their extractive activities, mainly for windfall profits, to acquire more mineral revenues, for investments, for economic growth. And the second is at the global level, if we look at how the geography changes in terms of where the extraction takes place, we then observe a disproportionate and uneven share of ecological cost. Meaning, of course, if we shift the pressure towards places like the DRC or Chile and Bolivia, where we will get lithium and cobalt, then of course they will have to bear the brunt of the ecological damages at the global level. Then that creates that inequality between different countries. Now, how did the EU respond to all of this? The first response is, of course, at least to raise the level of political debate in terms of the need to have a primary supply chain within Europe. So the idea that we should start thinking about new mining projects within Europe. Um, one of the most important element here is to use the trade and development strategy of Europe, trade diplomacy, in order to promote opening new mining projects, if not in Europe, in particular, in this case, in Africa. But the assumption still here on this of this approach is that if we can't produce them in Europe, the world market will solve it. Meaning, you will still be able to buy them. Maybe we'll buy them more expensive, at a higher cost, but we will still be able to get them in the market. So this particular strategy of opening new mining projects hasn't been very popular, either at the EU level or at the national level, for two reasons. One is that historically, Europe never had to extract minerals except in the western part of Europe, like Germany, um, because they could get it from the colonial territories in the past. So the reason why we don't have a European Geological Survey, for example, and the reason why even the EU Commission does not know exactly how much minerals the EU has is because there's so limited geological knowledge, is because EU never had to think about extracting, within its own borders. And so the challenge in the future, of course, is if we're going to start thinking about new mining projects, we need to invest and build capacity in terms of knowing what we can do within our own borders. But secondly, I think the idea still is that is to defend the international economic order built around competition and access to world markets. I think fundamentally, in all the policy debates that I've been to, the default position of people, of policymakers, of businesses is we're still going to be able to buy them in the world market. And I think that's one of the kind of answer whenever people say we don't want new mining projects in Europe, we can get them from somewhere else. The second strategy, which I think you would be more familiar with, is the EU's strategic investment in creating a secondary supply chain. So this is basically investing significant amounts of R&D and also encouraging companies to promote recycling, industrial recycling mostly, not consumer recycling. And the focus is reducing resource waste, improving resource efficiency, and I think most importantly, it's really closing the loop so that we can, extend the life cycle of products. This becomes an important strategy, a second order strategy for countries who don't want the first strategy on mining. And just to give you an illustration, in Sweden, because it is historically a mining country, they're more amenable to the first strategy of opening new mining projects. So that's why we have the decarbonization of steel project in the northern part of Sweden. Whereas in countries like France, there's a lot more concern over new mining projects in Portugal as well, and so they would opt and support an R&D, a policy that would promote the secondary supply chain. And the EU has emphasized and put a lot of political weight in this strategy, in part because it's easier for member states to agree. Like, it's quite hard to actually say, I don't want recycling. The issue, of course, is the technical detail of how you're going to do recycling. That's the main problem. It's, can we actually have industrial recycling? How feasible is it, etc. And so the answer to that question is, because it's a feasibility question, it's a much easier political choice to make as opposed to the first one. But as some of the research has already done, and I think your group is part of that, it's, recycling is always going to be a second best strategy because of the demand that we are foreseeing with the minerals. So in the end, I think it is politically easy to say that we want recycling, but in reality, the strategy needs to be both. And I think it will still take a while before we can get to that point where they would accept that new mining projects will need to be done within the European Union. And then finally, the third strategy is the substitution of minerals, of materials and systems. The main issue, of course, is raw material substitution often fail because, as the map has shown, you're basically trading off one material from the other. So you're trading off your dependence from, let's say, South Africa to Russia or to Turkey. That's one problem. The other problem is, because of the demand for base metals, for all the types of minerals that we need for the energy transition, we're going to just shift the demand from increasing demand for rare earth to increasing demand for copper. So let's say now currently there's a lot of there's a lot of studies that are trying to create rare earth-free permanent magnets. But then it will require other minerals. And so we're going to shift that dependence from accessing the mineral in China, because that's where most of the permanent magnets come from, in Japan, towards somewhere else where we'll need to get those minerals. The second point on the substitution strategy is that the EU actually doesn't want to play an investment role here. They are quite comfortable they're quite comfortable and they're quite confident that the EU firms, will be able to develop cheaper substitutes. So it's again a reliance on the market to find substitution systems, because that's how companies work in order to promote their own efficiency. The unintended effect, of course, is there will be new technologies that will be developed, but then we may be creating future supply gluts without realizing it, because we're basically shifting the demand from one to the other. So the bottom line, I think, of all these strategies is that they're mostly really focused on the supply side, meaning, what can we do in order to get more access to the mineral? as opposed to addressing more fundamental problems such as how do we address the consumption, industrial consumption, consumer consumption of these minerals, of the products that are produced in the downstream segment. So there is again, I think, an imbalance in terms of looking at the supply and the demand and how we might need a more balanced approach in these two areas. Um, I'm not going to go into in terms of what, I think I have said enough in terms of what are some of the problems here. But I think the only thing I want to point out is, at least at the policy making level, the EU has now accepted that. So in the past, they've always said that, China played the game of globalization. And now I think they've already realized that China has never played those rules of the game. They've taken advantage of the game, and therefore that's what gave China a more competitive advantage vis-a-vis the other countries. The second is that we always perceived that commodities, just like manufacturing and agriculture, is based on the logic of the market, that you can access them in the world market. But in fact, that was a perception. Historically and fundamentally, materially, primary materials are subject to oligopolistic, if not monopolistic control, especially in countries where they have a lot of these reserves. And with the right policies, they could exercise that control. And I think a good example here is copper versus rare earth, because in copper, even if Chile has 35% control over the market, Chile never exercised and used its pricing power to influence copper. And that has, for many reasons, they've done that. The difference is China is doing the opposite. China is outcompeting potential suppliers. China is using its domestic market as a leverage for companies. And so China is quite happy to use its oligopolistic, monopolistic position in order to direct raw materials market. And that's the big change. And I think that is a realization that has now come through at the EU level. And then finally, I think it is important that all of these things matter, and they're quite important, right? But what never gets discussed whenever we talk about these things is that the actual motivations and national interests of the mining countries that produce them. And I think this is where our project is trying to come in, because we think that there will be different models and different policies that will be implemented in order for countries to take advantage of the supply chain, to move up in the value chain. They don't want to become raw material producers just like during the colonial times. And so to realize this renewable energy transformation in the West, there needs to be a reconfiguration of power, of interest, and a compromise needs to be made between the producing countries and the consuming countries. Whether that is going to be in the context of a bilateral treaty or a trade policy or an economic framework, a regional framework, all of whatever mechanism is going to be put in place, it needs to take into account that mineral producers will resist any attempt to just extract the mineral without any clear concrete benefits for them, either nationally or even at the community level. So I want to close this by just giving you sort of the picture of what happens now. The first is that now the debate on strategic autonomy have become even more intensified, because there's a perception at the policy level that resources are becoming weapons, particularly if we think of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, how China is becoming more militarily aggressive. So the idea of strategic autonomy becomes even more important to be concretely identified by the European Union. Secondly, there is a much more complex geopolitical alignment. And I think today in this conference that I'm here in Berlin, this is one of the lessons that I thought, that I wanted to impart. We're not just looking at Africa per se in terms of the race for resources. We also have Central Asia and Latin America, potentially even within the European borders. Central and Eastern Europe and Southern Europe are quite important places where resources will be extracted. So the race for resources are going to be intensified, but the geopolitical alignments will not be as clearly laid out as it was in the past. It's not going to be the Cold War scenario where it's Russia versus US. It's not going to be China versus US. It's going to be a lot more complex and messy. And because of that, strategic autonomy is really important in the sense of we need to have a core set of principles on how to engage with different countries, with different firms, in order to be able to maneuver and overcome the challenges of the 21st century. And um, I think I'm going to stop there. I mean, I wanted to talk about the recent event in the US, but I think we can talk about that in the discussion. But I think that overall sums up the point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jojo. Well, I'll give a real hand, and I will probably see a lot of virtual hands coming along. So thanks. Very interesting presentation. I would like to say I really liked it, and I really liked your perspective on things, which is a very different perspective from the thing that most of us are normally looking at. And this is kind of the sideline that we know a bit about, but you obviously spent really some time on studying these issues, and I find it fascinating, to be honest. I'm sure there are a lot of questions, and I'll just open the floor with Jan Henk. You're the first one to raise your hand.
Hi, Jojo. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. I just realized, and I'm going to send a mail to René, that this was very interesting for a lot of people I haven't seen in the attendee list. So I'll mail René on that later. But thank you very much. Very interesting. And the strategies you said, it's the three strategies you said, it's or this, or that, or that. But what I heard in the conversations in Brussels and with other European, EU officials, it's more not or but and, so it's a combination of. And what I did miss in, so that's the first question. So how do you see that? And the second one, but I think you kind of covered that, but I just want to mention it. Apart from recycling, also there's a huge focus on new business models and remanufacturing, because with our technology in Europe, we can recycle about very good smelters. Our hydro and pyrometallurgists can take back about 17, so 17 different types of metals, while in a average laptop there are at least 40 different types of metals. Recycling is not always wholly apart from the whole quality issue. So I just want to also make a remark on this, but also I want to ask you, how do you see remanufacturing? So two things, it's instead of or, it's and. How do you see that? And also recycling expanded more to other things like remanufacturing, but also new business model, longer lifetimes. Thank you.
Do you want to collect a couple, René, or you want me to go? Because I saw.
No, please just start answering. We'll go it one by one. Yeah.
So I think that in an ideal world, we think that it's an end, that they would pursue all of it, right? The issue, of course, and this is where my political scientist hat comes in. Politics is about priorities. There's a finite amount of resources and energy there, and whenever you open a policy proposition, people jump into there, and so it's kind of really hard to maintain two different pathways at the same time. So I would say definitely based on our work, our data collection, we know that the EU doesn't even want to do the substitution. Like they just left that to the private sector. Like the companies will figure that out. We're not going to invest at all. Like okay, maybe we invest in terms of R&D, but nothing more. So the main question is the circular economy, is it an end between the circular economy and the primary mineral production? Is it an or? I think the EU is trying to use both in terms of whenever they engage at the national level. So for example, in Sweden, because there's a higher level of social acceptability for mining, it's not as problematic to talk about, there's a lot of EU pressure on Sweden to start opening new mining projects. This is for sure. And that's creating a lot of pressure domestically because, of course, the problem with all of this, well, not the problem, but the fundamental issue in all of this is that this is a dance between the EU regional policy and how you sell that domestically. And that's always going to be the difficulty, like in some countries, it's more acceptable than in others. So in places where you could sell the new mining project approach, why not, right? I think that's gonna be the most optimal position. When you start seeing the resistance, then you kind of test and then you stop. In Sweden, I think we know for a fact that they were fine with the decarbonization of steel project in the north, but they refused to have the rare earth project in central Sweden because it's quite close to a lake. And there's a lot of, I think that they refuse to give the environmental permits to the company there. So in that sense, the EU wouldn't necessarily push for the rare earth project, but they would be happy to support the decarbonization of steel project by the big Swedish companies. So I think in a sense, they are trying to do both, but the overall picture to me is still that the less politically contentious strategy is the recycling strategy. So to me, I feel like that's where the EU really wants to put money in, and maybe that's where it's going to be. Also, for us, in terms of researchers, it's quite important to identify. So I also think if, given that we're in the same space, in the critical mineral sector, I suspect that that's where they would put in money. So recycling rare earth, for example, is a big area of research that they're really interested in. The production of rare earth-free permanent magnets, trying to recycle some of the mining waste and the tailing. So I think this is where the focus of EU legislation would be. The question on remanufacturing. So I know this debate in terms of is this the same as the offshoring, the reshoring debate? No, like basically they want manufacturing to come back. Is that what you meant, or no? It's a different.
No, just the focus is now on recycling, while a lot of metals, critical raw materials, cannot be recycled for technical reasons.
Ah, okay, yeah.
So therefore, but when you remanufacture, you keep the metals longer in the loop.
Okay, so basically,
repair,
yeah,
remanufacturing,
so extending the life cycle, the life cycle.
Yeah.
I actually have, So I think this is gonna be the promising. This is sort of the promising regulatory part in the regulatory trajectory, because there's a demand, I think, for consumers to be able to do more. Individually at the household level, they want to be able to recycle more. So I suspect that there's going to be political support for that. And then the other issue is, of course, a product design. So basically, they're encouraging companies to change the design of the product so that they could last longer. So I know that they're going to put in some investments in R&D support for these types of work. In the EU conference, the raw materials conference I went to last year, they had a company called Fairphone presenting their product design there. And I think the idea, it's a really small company, so I suspect it's just they're trying to of course try to sell the company, but the basic idea is that if a small company can do this, that we can scale it up, and provide support for companies. Yeah, I think I would say that's gonna be the direction for that.
Thank you for your answer. Thanks.
Yeah, we have only a little time left. Catherine, I'm sorry, I want to skip the line a bit because I have one question that I really would like to ask. One of the things that you said is that what we would really need is a set of guiding principles, I think, to engage with these producing countries. And that's something that has been on my mind quite a bit. I mean, we are in this struggle for resources at the moment, and we see China playing power politics and also having bilateral agreements, and with their Belt and Road Initiative really also providing a lot of economic incentives, so to say. So what can the EU actually do what is their competitive edge in that kind of relationship? What can we offer that China cannot offer, for example? I find it, well, a very complicated, complex question, but maybe you have an answer for me. Oh, you're muted now, sorry.
Okay, so I think there's two answers that I perceive here. One is in terms of the big vision has to be where we have to aim for a new kind of model for extraction, because the colonial model in the past didn't work really well. And I think replicating that in Central and Eastern Europe, in Portugal, that's really what generates the resistance of the communities, because you're leaving the communities without anything. So I think apart from the technology, improving technology in order to be more environmentally safe, I think the general logic needs to be that we need to find ways in which the communities and the producing countries are given more space to say what they want and what they need. So I think at the principle level, that's quite important. At the policy level, what I perceive are important are in at least from the mineral producing side, the acceptance by the consuming countries that local content policies will be put in place, because that's really one of the ways in which you can generate spillover effects in the economy. That's how you avoid the enclave economy in the mining sector. That's how you can create new companies in Nigeria or in Tanzania. And so accepting that countries that produce these minerals will want more benefit from the mining industry in order to at least compensate for the effects, the socio-economic, socio-ecological effects. At the principal level, if we accept that, then I think the policies like local content, increasing the number of professionals and services sector within the countries where they operate, these are policies that the EU needs to start accepting as legitimate policy responses to by the mineral producing countries. The last point is on technology acquisition, because unlike oil and gas, so the big difference between oil and gas and mining is that oil and gas is the perfect example where domestic national champions and domestic companies were able to find their comparative advantage, and therefore they were able to have a bigger share of what was an oligopolistic market, right, in the early 1900s. So if we remember with oil, it was basically controlled by 7 companies, and then that became diversified, and national oil companies became the more dominant model. Of course, there are a lot of problems with that model, but I think technology acquisition is one of the most important ways in which development can happen in these countries. And ultimately, if the bargain is access to mineral and development for these countries, then I think the access question needs to become secondary and allow for, an experimentation of the kind of policies in order to develop the resource sector, in order for more benefits to come in these mining countries. And I think that that kind of eases, at the very least, the contention, particularly by environmentalists, because the problem is the mining is I think mining is very it's almost like a polemic, right? You either say you're pro mining or you're anti mining. So people have this general idea. The way to solve that is to say, well, you actually have policies that have worked in the past, that it may or may not succeed, but let the mineral producing countries do their thing and let them design the policy. If it fails, it may fail for many reasons, but at the very least, that space was given to them. And I think that's the kind of diplomatic, economic, and trade policy response that we should be promoting, particularly from countries like Japan and Korea and the EU, where you're not interested in developing your own resource base here. So if you're going to just extract them from the world market, you have to, it's not an abstract world market, really. We're really saying we're extracting them from DRC, right? From Bolivia.
Right.
So I think that's the main issue. Ultimately, I think we need to accept that the costs will be higher. It's not going to be the 19th, 20th century extraction where, you could just come in and take them. And I think that's going to be the advantage vis-a-vis China, because China is replicating the colonial logic. And I think that's the being careful and being clear in terms of the intention and what you're allowing in terms of policy space, I think that's going to be the advantage. That's where we should be moving forward.
Thank you very much. I think that was an excellent answer, and it helps me a lot at least. So I hope also that others learn from that. Apologies again to Catherine for jumping the line. But thanks again, Jojo. Our time's up for now, but I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about this in the future. And thanks for an excellent presentation, and yeah, thanks for joining our talks.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'll send the PowerPoint to the group as well.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.